All right, American history class. Uh, Good morning, good afternoon. Not sure what time you guys will be accessing this, so I'm recording this in the evening on Tuesday, right? Yeah, Tuesday the 21st. So real quickly, just some elements of context for you. So most of you probably saw that I sent an email out yesterday. An eel. I'm not sure what that was supposed to be. Yes, I sent an eel out yesterday. I sent an email out yesterday through the Converge system regarding the the distinct lack of Zoom lecture video watching for a portion of the class. So here's what I would say. Please go and take a look at that original email from Monday, but also be aware that I sent a follow-up today, and I had to address some things because I was getting some emails from students and we're getting the wrong idea of you know, my thoughts on my Corbin students. So I sent a follow-up email. I think it's a pretty good context and affirmation, pretty by comparison much more encouraging. So here's what I would say. I like you guys, care about you guys. It's my job to care. It's your job to do your job. So I guess my hope is at this point that we're on the same page, and that same page would be just like when we're on campus together and you come to class, which is my expectation. I expect you guys to be in class when we're there, right? So these Zoom lectures are functioning essentially as our class sessions. Class sessions are not optional. They're part of the course. So I'm assuming we're probably on the same page now. If you happen to be a student who's been neglecting your class time attendance responsibilities, okay, well, this was hopefully a lesson for you, but never mistake my disappointment for anything like dislike. So that's the second message that I sent out today. uh, I wouldn't trade my Corbin students for anyone. So I miss you guys. I want you to finish the semester strong. Moving forward, if we have to do a remote learning environment, then maybe there are some lessons here for all of us. The lesson for you guys is you do your job as students, and you carry forth with your expectations or with the expectations I have for you. Maybe my lesson here is I have to find ways to maybe build in some accountability to the system. So I'm not going to worry about that right now. Let's finish the semester strong. We're good, I hope. Um, I'm continue to miss you. I continue to care about you. So as I said, I think we're probably good. All right, let's dig into the 21st, well, the last decade of the 20th century, and then on into the 21st today. On Friday, I'm just going to frame some basic components of what's been happening in American culture over the past 15 plus years at that point. So today is going to be about the 1990s and then just into the 21st century, just some major events. And I'm just going to try to do a little bit of contextual synthesis as I go, and remind you of a couple of things from a philosophical and worldview perspective, as we've occasionally done, pretty consistently done throughout the course of the semester, coming back to these worldview grappling moments in time. So we talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which begins in 1989 and stretches forth for a few years. And that creates a lot of challenges for the United States. And here's where I'm going to start the time today, is to try to connect the end of the Cold War. Yes, I know these glasses are kind of outlandish, to be honest with you, but they do help me see the screen a little bit better. I don't have to wear them all the time, but I'm discovering that my My eyes are getting a little bit stranger the older I get, so I'm actually pretty okay seeing things far off, but when it comes to seeing things closer, I need these ridiculous reading glasses. So forgive me for that. That's just the way it goes sometimes. So let's start by framing some difficulties geopolitically beyond our shores, so on a more international contextual basis here. So Soviet Union is no more by the 1990s. What this means is that the United States becomes almost overnight the lone superpower in the world. Many of our NATO allies had been kind of pushed to the brink with their own economic capacities in support of the United States. And it's not that they evaporate and don't want to be our allies anymore, but you know, many of the global oversight roles fall to the United States almost overnight, and it becomes very clear that that is not a role anyone wants to actually fulfill. You know, the global policeman role is not something that anyone should be hankering to undertake. So the United States very quickly finds itself in some very difficult moments. Early on, we see this even with something like the Persian Gulf War from 1990 and 91. So I was just coming out of high school and my, you know, heading to college, and this all broke out when this was happening when I was, you know, a young man at college. And so I was, the reason I say that is I sometimes ask students, or I sometimes have students ask me if I was there. No, I was not there. I was still in college. One of my pals who was a few years ahead of me in high school graduated and went to the Naval Academy, came out of flight school in 1991, and one of his first postings was as air support in the Gulf War as a first lieutenant. And so I interacted with him quite a bit during the whole invasion, and as he flew Harrier jets in support of our ground forces over there. But I was still in school myself, so I was not in a combat zone. So a couple of things that I just want to mention. The Gulf War, you know, this is not my effort to make you guys go through the all the details of the war. I just want to frame this in an international sense. So the Gulf War is essentially about Saddam Hussein, forcing Saddam Hussein to back off and to relinquish control over certain areas in the Middle East, particularly the Kuwaiti oil fields, which had come into question at this moment in time. You know, the UN resolutions had not been obeyed by the Iraqis, and essentially what excuse me, essentially what Saddam Hussein did was he tried to call the UN's bluff when they said, you know, withdraw from Kuwait or else. And Saddam Hussein basically said, no, I don't believe you. I'm going to stay here. I kind of like these oil fields. And so the decision was made for this invasion to take place. And what this really amounts to, the Gulf War, by the way, it's over so quickly. There are two operations. There is an Operation Desert Shield, which leads as kind of the buildup phase to the actual combat operations, and then Operation Desert Storm. By the way, if you reference Operation Desert Storm on your exam, try to remember to use just the one S, Desert Storm, because otherwise it just doesn't sound nearly as impressive if you're writing to me about Operation Desert Storm. Just doesn't have the same exact impact. I just thought I'd mention that in passing. So General Norman Schwarzkopf is the overall military commander during the Desert Storm phase. And what we see here is what Americans and what people the world over see here is this overwhelming sense of integrated American combat forces in the Middle East. It's air and ground forces working pretty well together, and the testing of new technologies like the stealth technologies, the emergence of all sorts of smart missiles and bombs that can track to targets independently. So it's the unleashing of American military power. And what this What this ends up doing, though, and here's where I'm going to pull this back out and try to make a connection for you. It's an overwhelming military victory for the United States. It's over very quickly. The casualties that the United States personnel suffer are almost all from friendly fire, by the way. So the American military deaths, something like of those deaths, something like 61%, if I recall correctly. I don't have the stat sheet right in front of me, but about 61% of American combat deaths in Desert Storm were actually from friendly fire. The remaining 41%, or the remaining 39% were due to engagement with Iraqi forces. But that being said, the critical thing here is that the overwhelming success and military combat victory in the Persian Gulf War mistakenly led both American civilians and also even American politicians and military high command to believe that the global policing status of the United States was certainly a role that we could fulfill and fulfill well with very few problems. And so it actually builds up this level of confidence as far as the US military capacity is concerned. And we discover very quickly that, in fact, many of the conflicts that we are ultimately absorbed in, that we choose to become a part of, that they're not nearly as quick and easy and as simple as something like the Persian Gulf War. Now, don't take that the wrong way. I don't think that military operation was simple, but from a geopolitical perspective, it's over very quickly. And mistakenly, the United States withdraws from the region, and Saddam Hussein is not, his regime is not ended. That obviously comes back to haunt us come 2002 and 2003. But this is one of the first forays that signifies how different the world really will be for the US. So President George Herbert Walker Bush, I don't want to completely blow past him. Look, his presidency begins with a bang, no pun intended, when it comes to the Desert Storm operation, 1990 and 91. And yet it is the domestic policies that kind of come back to haunt the elder President Bush. He famously makes a pledge to not raise taxes. In a famous part of his campaign, talks about no new taxes for Americans. There are a couple of different relatively mild recessions that take place in late 1989 and on into 1990. There's another one that takes place in early 1992. And during both of these sequences, the Bush administration decides that, in fact, there is no alternative but to raise taxes. It wasn't a massive tax hike, but it still went against many of his campaign promises. And I think, in one sense, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War with Operation Desert Storm, goes against President Bush in one particularly important way. It happens in 1990 and 91. If it had happened closer to the election year of 92, I think we might have seen greater electoral success for President Bush, but that didn't happen. The American memory is relatively short by comparison to the rest of the world, and the success in Operation Desert Storm was enough it was in the rear view mirror enough that American voters were more concerned about more recent or present realities, and they were not really giving his administration as much credit for Operation Desert Storm at that moment, at that crucial electoral moment. And it came as something of a surprise that President Bush did not win re-election. His opponent was a younger former governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who comes to, I have to say I heard his name in passing, but I was not overly familiar with Bill Clinton in 1992 when this election happened. And Clinton pulls off an electoral victory for the presidency that surprised many at the time and inaugurated, the Clinton years, as we well know. Clinton is, his wife has become, equally famous since, but she was certainly not a household name in any way, nor was he at the time. Bill Clinton was a disciple of a political disciple, I should say, of John F. Kennedy. He admired him. The picture on the left is a reminder. As a young man in his teen years, he'd met Kennedy and had this lifelong, very compelling, kind of worshipful association with John Kennedy. And it's important to note that Bill Clinton, especially compared to his wife, politically speaking, in the year 2020, Bill Clinton was a much more moderate Democrat. And so one of the major reasons he won in 1992 and even in 96, one of the major reasons that he won is because of his moderate tones when it came to both domestic and foreign policy, specifically his ideas about a resurgent American economy. And so his appeal was really because of that moderate ground that he covered. He is very reminiscent in my perspective, although there is no military connection, but he's very reminiscent of Dwight Eisenhower in this respect. Eisenhower, by the way, in many different ways, probably could have functioned, even in his own lifetime, could have functioned as a moderate Democrat instead of a moderate Republican. He certainly borrowed heavily from the ideologies of both political parties, as did Bill Clinton. He did much the same. And I think that element really won him a lot of interest and some support. Now, the reason I tell you this is because I think for some, the tendency is to just focus on the sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky and to write off Bill Clinton, as this amoral president who just didn't care about his responsibilities to his family, to the American people, and was so crass that he was, having, sexual relations with an intern in the Oval Office. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it is important to remember why Bill Clinton garnered so much support and why, especially with the American economy, we see that there are some surprising decisions that many actually thought would doom the Clinton administration. There were some surprisingly effective economic decisions taken by Bill Clinton and his economic advisors that ultimately proved to be reasonably effective. Very similar, I mean, it's not the same economic policy to the letter anyway, but very similar to Ronald Reagan in this sense. Reagan's economic plan took about 2.5, 3 years to really show results, and that we see some of that with Bill Clinton as well. It's interesting that actually, despite Democratic claims to the contrary, a good portion of Bill Clinton's economic plan partially resembles that trickle-down economics theory that was, at the foundation, at the core of the Reagan administration's economic policy. And I think that deserves to be mentioned. So I want to tackle a couple of things. The NAFTA trade agreement, to this day, this one gets a lot of debate, and it should. The idea was that the United States was, instead of having a complete entrepreneurial independence with its corporations, its various entities, that the United States was going to embark on a trade and economic trade agreement with its two closest geopolitical neighbors, Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. The idea is that by engaging in this triangular framework of trade and corporate business, that all three countries would mutually benefit. The problem with, I'll hit the problem first and then we'll talk about some of the payoff. The critiques, and there are some good reasons to critique NAFTA. One critique, and I think it has merit, is this: that because Canada and Mexico were not able to offer nearly as much infrastructure when it came to the free trade agreement, the costs of of ratcheting up NAFTA and putting it in play and actually getting corporations to farm out, various corporations to farm out their production crews and their production sites and all the rest. The lion's share of the infrastructure that was required for all of that to take place, actually that burden fell on the United States. Then and now, that continues to be one of the major critiques of NAFTA. And Bill Clinton downplayed it, but you know, most of the thoughtful journalists of the time and most of the thoughtful economists of the time didn't let him, kind of sweep it under the rug. And that is a critique that deserves to be mentioned. And indeed, as NAFTA was ratcheting up those costs, most of those costs really did fall in the US. However, to the surprise of critics like myself and many others, initial critics, NAFTA has proved, over time, proved to be more beneficial than critics would have initially, initially thought it to be. So the costs were heavy to begin with, but the production levels for a number of companies have actually proven to be very beneficial. So Ford's, which a good example is Ford. Okay, so Ford ends up opening a number of plants. There's only one plant, I believe, one major plant up in Canada, a couple of different plants in Latin America, specifically in Mexico, and the idea, critics initially believed that the building costs would actually marginalize the profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, Ford has been very forthright about this. They themselves were pleasantly surprised by corporate profits and by some of the cooperative nature of this agreement, and it has actually benefited the Ford Motor Company in ways that they did not foresee themselves. So it has not been the catastrophe that some critics thought it would be, but it is also, it was not this perfect dream scenario that the Bill Clinton administration portrayed it to be from the very beginning. As with most things, it has some positives and certainly some negatives. Okay. Back to some major challenges. And this pertains to a film that you guys watched called Black Hawk Down. This is a situation in Somalia in 1993. It's a highlight of the major struggles that the United States begins to see regarding the requirement of becoming a global policeman. So as the United States is this new lone superpower in the world, it is often called in to try to manage some very difficult scenarios. And this particular moment comes to the forefront in the fall of 1993. I was at university watching this event unfold. The photograph in the lower right-hand corner of the screen is a dead US sniper named Gary Gordon, whose body was being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. And I remember waking up in the morning and seeing this on CNN. And, I was aghast, thought it was just a horrific sequence. And then the world became aware of what had just happened. So the Somali warlord, General Mohammed Farah Aidid, he and his cohorts decided to begin intercepting international food aid shipments and to not allow that food to be distributed. And this is all during a horrible time of famine in Somalia, and actually in the northeastern Horn of Africa, there was a catastrophic famine that affected millions and millions of people. And warlords like Aidid stepped in and took advantage of this and did so for monetary gain and for power. And so a number of UN forces were called to the region. They had limited success in hunting down and finding Aidid or some of his key lieutenants. And so the Clinton administration decided to call in US Special Forces and have them begin to try to deal with this situation. And the famous Black Hawk Down episode takes place in this moment in time. Pretty horrendous situation, to be honest with you. So where these special ops guys are put in a very difficult situation, and it got worse when they are on a raid in downtown Mogadishu, in one of the highly volatile districts where there is a lot of arms trading, black market arms trading going on, and these special forces go in to try to capture a couple of Adid's lieutenants, which they do, but then there's a firefight with the locals, and it just gets out of control. And some US soldiers are killed, along with quite a few Somalians in this particular incident. It is just a stark reminder of how difficult international geopolitics really became for the United States in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. So maybe in one of the lessons from the end of the Cold War is that, be careful what you wish for, because as the United States is forced in this very volatile moment in its history, it is forced to contend with these various global scenarios. And the expectation seems to be, well, this is a difficult situation this part of the world finds itself in. Time to call in the Americans. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. This was certainly one scenario where things became very difficult. Another scenario is Bosnia from 1992 to 1995. And the Balkans, that part of the world, had been a hotspot for all sorts of ethnic rivalries for a very long time, generations, in fact. If you will recall, this part of the world is where we deal with the first major shot of World War I, right? The assassination of the Archduke. Well, that is the Balkans. It is a volatile part of the world. And with the ethnic rivalries that existed in this part of the world in the 1990s, the United States and the British and the French are absorbed into this, just this quagmire of ethnic rivalry. There's the famous term that comes about as ethnic cleansing. Croats, Serbs, Muslims, they're all at war in the region. It is a very difficult path to maneuver through, as the UN forces, as these various national entities like the US are trying to oversee these efforts to stabilize the region. And yet those actions become very difficult to undertake, in large measure because a lot of the rules, right, the rules for combat become very difficult. The French and the British and the American forces are often held at bay by UN regulations telling them that the rules of engagement require them to be held at bay and to not engage, even if they see some pretty horrific things being done by Serbs against Croats and others in the region. There are some really horrific scenes that are, the one in the lower left corner of the slide here is depicting this. These killing fields where hundreds, in a couple of cases, thousands of dead bodies are just deposited in these pits, and the ethnic cleansing elements become just horrific realities. Without going into all the geopolitics here, trust me when I tell you this is just a nightmarish moment in European warfare and European relations. My friend Rich was again, he was a pilot, graduate of the Naval Academy. At this time, he was still flying Harriers before he transitioned to flying F-18s. And my conversations with him about Bosnia are just haunting ones. It was one of his more traumatic memories of his career as a flight officer for the United States Navy. Okay, back home to the United States. When we think about the 1990s and some of the major events that populate our memories, this certainly stands out. So 1992, there are some race riots that occur in LA. stemming from the beating of a man named Rodney King by police, stirs up a lot of antagonism between especially Black Americans in LA and law enforcement officials that gets national coverage. This, just kind of a resurgence of conversations about race in the United States are brought to the forefront. Added to this, we get the infamous scene that we who are alive anyway still remember very distinctly, and that is the white Ford Bronco, driving down a highway with police, racing down behind it. And we're all, American audiences are shocked to learn that they are chasing one of the more famous American sports figures, O.J. Simpson, who had a long professional career and one of the great running backs in professional football, but also had transitioned into a pretty lucrative acting career, playing some bit parts and doing some commercials, and was regarded by many as a very lovable personality, actually. So a very magnetic personality. Then we learn that he was being charged for the murder of his wife and her lover at the time, and this becomes a long, drawn-out public trial, right? That was just excruciatingly long, but also it brought the angst of race relations to the forefront in very clear ways. And nothing was more clear when the verdict was handed out from the trial. And to be honest with you, I have to say that the prosecuting attorneys made a lot of mistakes during the trial, and they did at times fail to show beyond a reasonable doubt that O.J. Simpson was in fact clearly connected by the evidence to the scene of the crime and to the murders and whatnot. Even though there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, there was some evidence that wasn't allowed to be admitted. He was acquitted of the crime, although there was ultimately another suit that was settled that he did not win. But in the initial trial, he was acquitted, and I'll never forget this moment, because when the acquittal was handed down, I was sitting with a bunch of my friends watching this, and there were television screens that we saw showing responses from different parts of America. And a lot of white Americans, if you saw the television screens, a lot of white Americans were stunned that O.J. Simpson was acquitted. I myself was not stunned. I personally believe that he was likely guilty of the charges, but I did think that the prosecutors failed in a lot of ways. But if you watched the television screens of Black Americans in particular, when the acquittal was announced, they were extremely thrilled by the announcement. And for many in America, it was a very, very interesting moment whereby both white Americans and Black Americans, respectively, they may have realized, man, that there's a completely different, there's a very stark divide in our country when it comes to race still. Even in the 1990s, maybe the idea had been that race relations had progressed so far that those kinds of distinct barriers were far less. Maybe not non-existent, but far less. And the O.J. Simpson trial just brought this back to the forefront in some pretty overt ways. And I think that really is important for you to know. Okay, the Monica Lewinsky scandal, I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I want to make sure. Okay, yes. So the Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton scandal, Lewinsky was an intern that was serving at the White House, and it was discovered that in fact she had a sexual relationship with the president, and that there were even sexual acts that were that had been undertaken in the Oval Office. Initially, there were a lot of denials by the president, but Lewinsky was subpoenaed and she gave testimony. There were others that were called in. It became, this ridiculous circus. And ultimately, there were some articles of impeachment that were brought about, that were introduced against President Clinton, and yet he was ultimately acquitted by the Senate and was not removed from office. But it was definitely one of these scandals that Americans will remember for a long time. And in my opinion, it's one of the tragedies of the Clinton administration, that the guy who's actually very, very capable as a politician and as a delegator in our government, whose policies I did not always agree with, but I agreed with a fair number of them, and his moderate politics actually proved to be surprisingly effective in some respects. So I was very upset that Bill Clinton had been stupid enough to and immoral to this degree. It very, very much frustrated me. Thought he did a lot of damage to the office of the presidency and should have obviously known better. And it was really unnecessary stain on the presidency and an unnecessary burden to American culture at the time. Whether or not he deserved to be removed from office because of the sexual scandal, that is a matter of debate that I'm not going to get into right now on the screen here. And since I'm not with you guys and I can't have an interactive discussion, I'm not going to dig into that moment. It was very disappointing, I will say that. Very frustrating and disappointing. And I think it is a reminder of how our politicians have contributed by their own actions, by their own stupidity, by their own lack of foresight, by their own sinful humanity. They've contributed to a real dramatic increase over the past 50 years or so. They've contributed to Americans having less and less and less confidence in their political leadership, and the assumption that American politicians are inherently corrupt, that the business is a corrupt business, and the art of politics is just an inherently corrupt avenue to undertake. And I don't think that the reality is that politics are necessary, and as politics is meant to exist, it can actually have a very beneficial and good function. But because of just this near constant corruption that we see with politicians and their actions, this has really undermined, I think, American confidence in the political process. And Bill Clinton has, obviously, his presidency certainly contributed to that. Before we move on into the 2000s, I just want to back up here for a second. It happened to be the anniversary yesterday of Columbine, so April the 20th. And I just want to mention in passing, I don't think I actually have the slide of it. So Columbine happened in April of 1999. I was living in Colorado at the time, doing my master's degree at the University of Colorado, and so and my wife actually worked in Littleton, about 3 blocks from Columbine High School, and so this all happened right, in the community that we were associated with at the time, and it was just a pretty overwhelming. And I just want to bring this to light because the school shootings, public shootings, these are ongoing conversations in American culture, and they're not likely to go away soon. And at the time and since, I've thought a lot about Columbine and about the 2 boys, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who some kids in our youth group at our church at the time, they actually knew Eric Harris and Dylan. I certainly didn't, but they knew them. And it's a reminder of how important our worldviews really are. And those 2 boys Dylan in particular was a follower. Eric Harris was the sociopathic leader of the two. But what they bought into, the nihilism, the self-defeatism, the idea that there is no purpose in life, the idea that that anarchy is present and there's nothing you can do about it. Thoroughly Darwinian naturalist perspective, something that we talked about earlier in the semester. The implications of that worldview are enormous, and they're important for us to contend against. And I saw in the wake of the Columbine shootings, the public reactions to them were very, very different, depending on who you were talking with. The accusations that were flowing and who was responsible, was it just the two boys, or was it, you know, was it anyone who had any of the students at the school who had been what teenagers tend to be, right? They'd been difficult, and they'd been in their cliques, and they'd perhaps offended one or both of the boys at different times. It was this moment in time where I was forced to see and contend with elements of American culture that I had never really seen before, specifically because that kind of violence at Columbine, I hadn't been exposed to in my own communities, and yet Littleton, Colorado is a sleepy upper middle class suburb of Denver, and you would not assume that kind of a violent act would be prominent, or that it would happen in that community, and yet of course it did. So all of these things were forcing Americans like me and many others to contend with emerging realities of our culture in ways that we hadn't been forced to before. So I wanted to mention that in passing. It's a memory that's very strong for me, and it's in a number of different ways. We're still contending with the mentalities, with the controversies of gun laws and all sorts of stuff. So I did want to mention it in passing. So the George Bush years, I'm going to come back to on Friday, because we're going to talk about some of the politics of the 21st century, walking us through to the present, but also some broader elements of culture. But I'm going to close today with September 11th. And for those of you who don't know me very well, or have not had me in classes before, I'll keep it together, but this is a particularly tough subject for me, as it is for most Americans. I acknowledge that. I don't want to single myself out as an American who is more affected than others necessarily, but this does have not only a broad cultural orientation for me, or a connection for me, it's a very personal one for me. And so I'm gonna talk about Todd real quickly. This is my friend Todd Beamer, who I grew up with in Wheaton, Illinois. Todd was actually a couple years ahead of me in school, but you may not know it to look at me, but I was an athlete growing up, and ended up doing a lot of my sports with some of the older kids, and so I played sports with Todd and a number of different traveling, school and traveling teams, and we got to be pretty close. We actually shared the same birthday, even though he was a couple years older than me, and just he treated me like a younger brother, and just really one of the great memories of my youth was being friends with Todd. And Todd was on Flight 93 on September 11th. And so for me, September 11th, as tough as that day already was, when I was watching my television that night and the broadcast came over the television talking about Flight 93, and Todd's picture came up on my television screen, I was just devastated. And all of the horrors of that day, which I certainly felt anyway, were intensified, and they became that much more personal. So just something for you guys to be aware of when we talk about September 11th. Maybe this is just a preaching to the choir, and something that would be patently obvious. it's sometimes tempting to turn September 11th into merely this cultural event, or this, kind of to depersonalize it, but never forget how deeply it affected people, and that, many Americans lost loved ones, many Americans lost friends, and these were tragic losses due to radical terrorism. So I wanted to mention that. I wanted to at least make the connection with you, because I think it's important. But I want to end that part of the story positively. So I miss Todd. I talked to his wife, Lisa, who I didn't know super well, but I knew her. And after Todd's death, I've kept in contact with her and her family. And so I talked to her throughout the year, probably, 3-4 times a year. And Todd's son, David, who I remember when David was born, and now David is a senior at Wheaton College, and he played football for Wheaton College, and it's just been a thrill to see David come full circle, and that there's been, Todd's legacy I see through his family, through his children, and so there's a really very encouraging and positive part to that story. So as much as I miss Todd, I love that there is much that God has done through the lives of his family and through his friends. Going back to September 11th, this tragic day has the implications we're still living with. And even though it has been 19 years, or almost 19 years, it is an event in our history that is every bit as meaningful as the attack on Pearl Harbor back in 1941. And the world in the post 9/11 reality that we have all lived through, the world changed. The world really was a different place. And the things that we had to contend with, not the least of which included radical terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism, those things may have existed in some form before, but the responses to them were very different in the post 9/11 world. And I posted a link for you guys on the Converge page that is, I think, something you need to watch in case you haven't, or haven't in a long time. And it's part of a CBS News broadcast with Bryant Gumbel, who is talking to a caller, and they're watching one of the burning buildings, and then another plane crashes into the second tower. And it is a very stark reminder of the day, and all the emotions that we all felt as what was initially questioned, right? The initial plane that hit the tower, there were many who didn't know, and nobody could have known initially. There were many questioning, well, was this an accident? Was it just some really idiotic pilot who lost control of his aircraft? Was this just a tragedy? But was this merely to be linked to an accident? But when that second plane hit the tower, everybody knew. Everybody knew in a moment, this is obviously an act of terrorism. And that realization that swept over us was just so dark and powerful and disturbing. I remember, I was in Nebraska at that time, so I'd finished my master's degree at Colorado, and my wife and I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, where I was working on my PhD at the university there. And boy, when this all happened, I remember kneeling down and praying, and I just couldn't believe that this was happening in our country. So a critical moment, critical event, and I wanted to leave that with you today as the stop-off point, or the stopping point for Friday's session, for Friday the 24th. We're going to come back, and I'm going to talk about some events in our world that have been part of your lives, that we're going to just try to talk through a little bit. So again, please, if you haven't already, look at my messages, both from yesterday, which was a bit of a scolding message, but also look at the message I posted today, which was a kind of a contextual affirmation. So I miss you guys. I want you to finish strong. Please do your work. Do it to your very best ability. That's what I want. It's what God wants for you too. I miss you. I'm praying for you. Yeah, blessings. Have a good evening.